Hello and welcome to AP Psychology. This is Miss Seguin, and today we're going to be talking about the biological basis of behavior. We are in Unit 2.1. Our objectives for the day, what we're going to learn today, we're going to discuss psychology's abiding interest in how heredity, environment, and evolution work together to shape behavior. Because ultimately the question that we're asking is, what causes human behavior, right? The second key is identifying key research contributions of scientists in the area of heredity and environment. Most of that objective we're going to do in class. And the third objective is we're going to predict how traits and behavior can be selected for their adaptive value. There's a lot of vocabulary in this particular lesson. Don't worry about writing down the definitions yet, but if you want to pause here, write down these words and you can start filling in some of those definitions as we go. All right, our first objective. We're going to discuss how heredity, which is genetics, environment, which is our society, our culture, and literally the room or the people we're around in the room we're in, and our evolution, which is our development over time, work together to shape behavior. Some key basics here. The term environment, we're going to refer to every external influence that exists. That could be the country you grew up in, the state you grew up in, the school you go to, the people you hang out with, your family members, so on and so forth. The second one is that we have, all humans have 46 chromosomes made up of 23 pairs, and those chromosomes are made up of DNA, which contains our genes. The third is that there are active genes or expressed genes, so genes that you have that are essentially turned on, and passive or inactive genes, or genes that you have that are essentially turned off. These depend on the environment, so the environment can affect our genetics. And then number 4, the genome, as a term, is all the genes that make up an organism, so in this case a human being. A couple extras here. Heredity. These are genetic traits that you inherit from your parents. And then evolution refers to development and adaptation over time. One of the biggest things that psychologists talk about is the nature versus nurture debate. And basically what that says is our nature or our genetics and our heredity, does that influence our behavior and who we become? Or does nurture influence our behavior and who we become, which is the way you're raised or the environment you're raised in or the school you go to. It's the part of your development that's not genetic. Here's a quote from a man named Thomas Lewis. He says, "While genes are pivotal in establishing some aspects of emotionality, experience plays a central role in turning genes on and off. DNA is not the heart's destiny. The genetic lottery may determine the cards in your deck, but experience deals the hand you can play. Scientists have proven, for example, that good mothering can override a disadvantageous temperament." So basically what he's saying there is that while genetics may determine what you are physically capable of, your nurture is the thing that allows you to pursue those things. All right, heredity and the environment. Our essential question here is nature versus nurture. Genetics or heredity versus the environment, which remember is every external influence on us. Methods of study within heredity and the environment. Biological psychologists are interested in studying the link between biological processes and psychological processes. So is a psychological process causing you to do something biological, so the behavior, right? Or is biology causing you to affecting your psychology essentially? So your hormones, your brain, your nervous and endocrine systems are very important in this unit. Behavioral geneticists, so we started with biological psychologists. Behavioral geneticists study the power and the limits of genetic and environmental influences on behavior. They're looking at mutations of DNA, they're looking at chromosome pairs, they're looking at your DNA, they're looking at your genes, and they're looking at the human genome as a whole. The next big method of study is twin and adoption studies, and some of these have been done unethically or even illegally. But we look at 3 identical strangers, for example, which is an example of one that was done illegally. And they basically essentially take these genetically identical children, right, because they're triplets, and they put them in 3 different environments to see if they can fully solve the nature versus nurture debate. ultimately, there were some things that were completely nature, but then some other things that ended up expressed or not expressed, or just coping mechanisms that ended up different based on environment. So what we come to is essentially both. Identical twins, or monozygotic twins, one of the things that they talk about here is that identical twins are genetically identical as well as physically identical, because your genes are what turn on the expression, right? Your hair color, your eye color, your speech patterns. So identical twins are going to be genetically identical, and so you want to see if two genetically identical humans, so nature wouldn't be, you're controlling for nature at that point, if a different environment would affect them differently. Fraternal twins are dizygotic twins. Basically what this means, let me break down identical versus fraternal twins. When conception happens in identical twins, these two babies end up being made from the same egg and sperm. Fraternal twins are made from two separate eggs and sperm that start at the same time. So there's still two babies, but they're not going to be genetically identical. Next we get to heritability. And heritability is going to tell us how much of the variation that exists between a group of individuals is due to their genetics versus their environment. So what heritability is not telling us is how much of a trait is passed on. So for example, if your parents have blue eyes and you have blue eyes, it's not talking about whether or not you'll get that trait. Does that make sense? What it is talking about is when you have several children and there are variations in those children, it wants to know how much of those variations is due to genetics and how much is due to environment. Okay, so when we get to this diagram, this is a diagram discussing heritability. And if you look at it, you have the first pot on the right, on the left, and then the second pot on the right. A and A, B and B, C and C, so on and so forth down to G are the same genotype. And so A matches with A, B matches with B, and so on and so forth. So what they're trying to show here is a diagram of how much of the differences between these groups is genetic, right? This is the heritability. How much of the variation is genetic? So A is going to match with A, but they're going to be in two different soil types. Now they've controlled for lighting, so lighting is not going to be an issue. Two different soil types with the presence of a nutrient or not, right? And genotype A performs worse in the deficient soil solution, right? And what they're trying to show here is that the difference between these groups is entirely environmental, because they've controlled for genetics and they've controlled for lighting. The only thing they're changing is the soil nutrient. So if they change the soil nutrient and the same exact genetics do worse, then the difference is entirely environmental. All right, another method of study for heredity and the environment. Molecular geneticists are going to study the molecular structure and function of genes and how they play a role in our behavior. Epigeneticists, this is my favorite, they look at how the environment influences how our genes are expressed without actually changing our DNA. So it's whether or not the genes are turned on or off, not whether or not the genes are there or not. Does that make sense? Okay. The genetics is the foundation. That's the part that, the DNA, the part that makes us who we are, right? The environment is what shapes you into the person you are. That's the basis of epigenetics. Each child in a family is different. Even though they have similar genetics, you and your sisters or brothers are going to be very different. Even though you come from the same set of DNA, right? In epigenetics, what they're really studying is these methyl molecules. Basically, life experiences lay down epigenetic markers, which is what they're really interested in, right? And these are methyl molecules that attach to a gene in your DNA strand, and they can turn it on or off. They can either block the expression of a gene or they can keep it on, right? So if it attaches, it'll block the expression of that gene. This changes how the gene works without actually ever changing the structure of the gene. Sometimes we end up with mutations. These are random errors that occur during gene replication that lead to a change. And so epigenetic markers will attach to a gene, but they're not changing the gene. A mutation is a change in the gene. So when the gene goes to replicate through the RNA, then it'll the instructions will get read incorrectly, or something else will happen and there's a mutation, which means the gene was basically built incorrectly. Okay, with this diagram, what they're looking at is an epigenetic marker, which is that purple on the lower genetic strand. There's a purple thing. That's an epigenetic marker. And what they're showing is that can attach to a gene and block the expression of that gene. All right, objective number 2. We're going to identify key research contributions of scientists in the area of heredity and environment. Charles Darwin is our big person here. We've talked about him a little bit, but today we're going to kind of get into evolutionary psychology a little more. Evolutionary psychologists, they focus on the principles of natural selection to explain our behavior and the mind. And remember, natural selection is this idea that we are more likely to inherit and to pass along traits that have been vital to our survival as a species. So with evolutionary psychology, we also get the biopsychosocial approach, which the biopsychosocial approach basically says that your behavior and who you become as a person are shaped by your genetics and your psychology or your mental state, as well as your environment. And so basically the biopsychosocial approach is where everyone went, well, all of it shapes who we are, and so they study all of it. Objective number 3, we predict how traits and behavior can be selected for their adaptive value. So we talked about natural selection, but which traits get selected? Why does it matter? So we have what's called the adaptive value of traits. These are traits that tend to be inherited. Those are the ones that tend towards higher adaptive value. So the traits that you will pass on as a person, those tend to be the ones that will lead towards adaptation. So the more adaptable you are to the environment, the better your chances of survival. I mean, think animals. If a deer is going to reproduce, they're going to create a fawn, and the fawn is going to look like, what does a deer look like? It camouflages in the forest, right? These are the traits that make you more likely to survive. It makes you more adaptable to the environment. So the more adaptable you are to the environment, that's a higher adaptive value for that trait. Those are the traits you're going to tend to pass on. Some examples of this: high intelligence versus low intelligence. High intelligence, you're going to survive better because you can think faster. You can think on your feet a little more. Fast metabolism versus slow metabolism. Now this one's tricky. You would think it would be fast metabolism, but in actuality, slow metabolism, or slower, not super slow, slower metabolism will actually allow you to survive longer because you can go longer without eating. And then several physical characteristics. So if you're stronger, mentally more here, so on and so forth, those things become physical characteristics that you'll pass on. Some of those things include eye color, hair color, and so on. Okay. In this lesson, we learned how heredity, environment, and evolution work together to shape who we become and our behavior. Then we discussed a key scientist, Charles Darwin, who contributed to the research about heredity and the environment. And we learned how we can predict which traits will be selected for their adaptive value. All right, I will see you in class tomorrow.